Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of my Boomer Buddies podcast, where we tell it like it was and is. I'm Rick Reed, joined again by my nephew, Flying Bryan Reed. Good to have you back, Bryan.
It's very good to be here. Thanks for having me, Uncle.
Always, always. Well, we share a lot of the same passions, and I want to find out why. You love music, you love culture from the past. I want to know, where do you think you got that from?
Oh man, again, it's got to be an osmosis thing. I mean, I grew up with a large and loving family, and it's like it takes a village kind of family, and everyone appreciates music. It's always been playing. The classic TV shows have always been on. All the good movies. So I've been lucky to be exposed to it, and not just a bunch of it, but a lot of good stuff too. I think, not to toot our own horn, our family's got some good taste in music and movies and culture, all that fun stuff. So I think I've been lucky enough to join the ride and grab onto it a little bit.
Yeah, you do have an encyclopedic knowledge of all things culture from back then. I'm very impressed by that. Give me a couple examples of some things from the past, from the boomer era, that you enjoy so much.
Well, it's definitely the music. There's parts of my generational music that I absolutely love, of where it's kind of evolved to.
Yeah.
But I think that rock and roll hit perfection in that late 60s era, and we're all just trying to fine tune it from there. The movies of that generation were incredible as well. But I think what I really, really like about especially like the 60s, 70s, was just the pendulum swing from how conservative everything was earlier in, preceding that. I mean, the 50s was very yes sir, no sir, bubblegum, and prior to that was extremely conservative as well. Just seeing the expressiveness of the youth is what has really given, I think, America in a lot of ways, a lot of posture outside of just industrial capability. We're a country and a culture that other people want to be because we're cool, for lack of better words.
So what you're saying is we're pretty uptight following World War II. The Greatest Generation, the sacrifices they gave us, that's well documented and appreciated. You're saying that you like the way things loosened up, and music wise and culturally.
1,000%. I think the embracing of being able to express oneself was something that was a breath of fresh air, and hasn't really been, the genie's been let out of the bottle. And so maybe a little too much at times, but I think it's very important for people to have the ability to share who they are and what they want to be, because there is some really cool magic that lives in there.
I agree. There's a lot of magic. And I also, now that I'm older, I wish that there were some restraints put up too. You can't go too far with anything. Yeah. Too much of it is not a good thing. But regarding the music and the TV shows, which are still in syndication, they were incredible. And I think culture-wise, a lot of people keep going back to that. I know my adult sons, they'll listen to music, they'll hear a song and they go, God, this is great. And I go, well, it was done before. I'm a believer. It was Monkeys, written by Neil Diamond, and they go, no, no, Smash Mouth, right? There's a lot of examples of songs that were done years ago, back in the 60s, 70s, that have been rehashed, and they want to take claim, or your generation wants to claim some things too, right? Is that frustrating for you to know that?
Oh, at times, most definitely. I'm now getting to the stride where, much like you just said, that my kids will hear a song on the radio and they'll be like, oh, this is so great. And I'll be like, oh, this is actually a remake of a remake, believe it or not, guys. This one's been around since Grandpa was born. So it's kind of interesting to see how it kind of goes, like, the whole circle of life thing. It's also nice to see them, through their own flavor, appreciate the other versions of things too, because they'll have a song they'll listen to, and then I'll play that original version. I'll be like, oh yeah, this is actually pretty good. And I'm lucky enough that especially the boys and Emily too, very much so, they appreciate it. They won't just say, "Oh, this sounds old, so I don't like it." They find the value in it too, which is great.
Give the ages of your kids, please.
I got 11, 9, and 6. Boy, girl. They're all fun and flair.
I have to tell you, listeners and viewers out there, that Bryan is an old soul. His dad, my brother, and I used to always quiz each other on music. We lived music together. We were 2.5 years apart, Randy and myself. And together, we would just form this knowledge by testing each other and living it. We'd hear a song on the radio and we equate what we were doing when that song was popular. And therefore, you can remember dates and things like that. In other words, it became part of our fabric, ingrained in our memory. Bryan has that too. In fact, I was always so impressed with him when I would go to New York for my board game trade show, music trivia for the record. One year I took Bryan along because my wife was about to give birth, and we had a wonderful time, didn't we, Bryan? Because you loved the music, you loved the game, and also you were able to experience New York City as a young man. How old were you then? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, I was about 20 years old, I think, on that trip. Yeah, that was an awesome experience. A fun town, great company, and being able to speak music with a lot of people who would come by and hit the booth. Just the vibe in that place was a great time. That was a wonderful experience. I'll never forget it.
Yeah, and I remember we went to Central Park and we saw the John Lennon mosaic on the Upper West Side, across from the Dakota. That was cool, being Beatles fans. In fact, you are a Beatles fan. You named one of your kids after something related to the Beatles, didn't you, Bryan?
Yeah, I'm a Beatles fan through and through, that's for sure. My oldest son's name is Jude. And my dog is even named after my favorite Beatles song, Rocky Raccoon. They are a band that will forever be embedded in my DNA. That's most definitely.
So I imagine, Bryan, when you do social functions, if you're at a trivia night somewhere at a restaurant, I suppose you're a big hit, aren't you?
If I could turn trivia into a career, I would retire what I'm doing right now. It's you kind of brought that encyclopedia thing up. I know my generation very well from growing up in it, but knowing your generation as well from growing up around it so much and watching Nick at Night. So I know all the little anecdotal characters and the fun things, and I grasp onto those things. And if I hear it, I'll remember it.
You're a dual threat.
Yeah, watch out now. Watch out. It's the old soul is absolutely correct. And it's come to my advantage too, because I work in my job. I'm usually the youngest person sitting at a table for dinner, but can hold my own in a conversation around anything 20, 30 years older than. So I thank you for some of my career success, Uncle Rick, for introducing me to some of this good stuff too.
That's just part of living. It just worked out that way. You have quirky observations in life, and that's what makes you fun. When you're in a room, it lights up. And I can see why you are successful in your career, because you are a people person. Just some of the things off the top of your mind, like Uncle Rick, he asked me off air, when you go to a urinal, what's the percentage of times that you spit in the urinal? Immediately, what did I say?
Like 100%.
100%. I think part of that is the sports upbringing, or spinning is part of the deal, but just quirky little things like that, Bryan. I just love that about you.
It's those weird observations. You think about it. Yeah, we were talking about, as a baseball player, you don't think about it. You just kind of turn and spit sometimes just because maybe it's part of your superstition, it's part of your routine, or just a tick your body picks up over time. But there is a 100% chance that if I walk up to a urinal, I'm spitting in that urinal.
And if that's off-putting to people watching or listening, hey, that's what it is. It is just what it is. And you know what? We don't even give it a second thought about spitting. And I can see how it could be just gross to some people, many people, yes, especially if you didn't play sports. And you can say, well, you're not playing sports right now, don't do it. Well, habits are hard to break, aren't they, Bryan?
That they are. That they are.
Now, you come up with nicknames for people, and that's something I like to do. It shows you like people when you give them a nickname. That's how I was brought up. That's how you were accepted in some of the neighborhoods back in the day that I grew up in. We all had nicknames. And what are some of the nicknames that you've given people? I know
Oh man,
you have cousins that you've given nicknames to. And
oh
what
yeah,
are the weird reasoning? What's the weird reasoning for those nicknames?
there's always a fun aspect to giving someone a nickname. It's a persona that they can live up to. Sometimes it's just a fun play on words at the time. There's one of my favorite cousins, Jessica. I call her Saucy because when they were younger, sometimes it's hard to say Jessie and it just comes out as Saucy. So even to this day, I still call her Sauce in some way, shape, or form. There's always an evolution of it.
Yeah, it's that one's evolved, I know.
Oh, most definitely, most definitely. And even I was on a Facebook debate the other day about some people who are raising chickens, and they gave a poll on what the chicken's name should be. And I threw my name in the hat for Gravy Boat was one of the options, and it was purely because of all the different spin-off nicknames that Gravy Boat can give you. The Gravy Train, GB Layton. There's so many good things that live in there, and I think a nickname is the ultimate term of endearment. It's kind of like if you're on a team, whether it be sports or work or whatever, you want to bust each other's chops a little bit. And if you're not getting poked and made fun of, it's probably because you're not one of them. And if you don't have a nickname, maybe it's because you're not one of them.
I love nicknames. Your grandpa was a giver of nicknames. And all us six kids were given nicknames by him. And I think that's kind of where it started for me,
I think so.
playing on teams or whatever. We all had nicknames. But I always find that interesting how nicknames evolve and develop.
100%. There's several of my friends who I still call as their nickname. They're in my phone as their nickname, and I probably would only call them their real name in front of their parents.
Right. And some have 3 or 4 nicknames.
Oh, most definitely. It's fun how just some of those evolutions come about. There's one of my favorite ones, and I didn't come up with a nickname, but people called him Stinky once upon a time. And then that ended up turning into, making fun of the voice of like, oh, you can't make fun of me. And someone was saying like, oh, whatever, Stinky, which then turned into Yingy. And I was like, Yingy might be the best nickname ever created.
I've never heard that.
It's just kind of how they evolve and turn into something new. And I'd love for that to be a nickname. Throw that on the back of a softball jersey and sell 10,000 copies of that one.
See, the mind is always working with you and with me. It's kind of scary sometimes. It's like, stop. The other day, it was last night, my son Ricky was in the refrigerator, like usual, and we were having a conversation from the living room into the kitchen, and we did picks for the U.S. Open, right? And we did a draft, and I misunderstood. I thought we were picking 5 people, and it's basically you pick one, and then you pick a ghost just in case. And, maybe you could parlay that into more money if the 2 people you picked finished ahead of everybody else's picks, whatever. And I totally misunderstood it. And I didn't do my number 1 pick as my favorite. And he goes, Dad, sometimes I wonder where your mind is at. And then I don't want to know where your mind is at. It's just too crazy of a place. I said, I can't agree with you. It's tough being in my head. And you're the same way, Bryan, with your brain.
Oh, it's going 1,000 miles an hour, and sometimes it takes something like music or a podcast to put it on in the background to tune it all out and help me focus on what I need to focus on. So that's why I love having Boomer buddies every week. That's why I love my other go-tos and some of my playlists. It helps with those things.
It's very rewarding to me to go on this venture since I retired, and to have a family member, you expect it, but to have a family member of your generation saying, I haven't missed an episode. Or if I'm a day late, I think early on I was a day late, and you said, where is it? So you're keeping me accountable, young man, and I love it.
Good content. I want to gobble it all up. All these conversations are very interesting, whether they be, just talking about some of the cool shows of the time, whether it be talking about experience coming back from Vietnam or Quincy's experience at Woodstock. It was great to meet him. Speaking of that New York trip, we got to have dinner with him. So I got to meet, he's one of the boomer buddies that I've been able to meet across.
I totally forgot that you met Quincy.
Yeah, it's a great dude.
He's amazing. He's a great storyteller. He lived the times. I called him the ultimate baby boomer, and another boomer friend of mine didn't like that. He says, how can he be the ultimate? You haven't met them all. And I go, well, you have a point there. But to me at the time, I really felt like he was the ultimate because he went to Woodstock for that fact alone. The topics that we cover are varied. We've got the serious one, the Vietnam. Art Dean, amazing guy. Amazing guy. And, going through stuff to this day for what he saw back there and what he sacrificed as a young man, it's serious, but he's getting through it, and music has helped him. The topics that we cover can be frivolous. Just did one on dad jokes, which was just, goofy. There's a way to play with my sound effects and be creative in that way. It was fun, but it's not hard hitting, right? So I want to do hard hitting. I want to have not just boomers on because there's different perspectives, but we all interconnect and interrelate. And I'm just so glad that you're on with your fresh ideas and your young family. I reminisce about my kids when I see you and your family, what you're doing, Bryan, and just keep emptying your brain out on things so I can follow and read and laugh.
Will do. Happy to do so. I want to tee you up with to bring this back on. Speaking of perspectives, to switch the tables on you.
Yeah.
I read a quote the other day that immediately made me think of you in the podcast and in a conversation that could be had either now or later. And it was, rock music in the 90s made music in the 60s look like the 50s. So let that soak in for a second.
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes sense to me as someone who grew up in the 90s, and my perspective of what that rock music turned into. It almost made 60s music feel a little softer and a little more conservative. But I'm curious through your lens of seeing how transformative that music from one decade to the next, and even leapfrogging into the 70s. How do you absorb that comment of rock music from the 90s makes the 60s look like the 50s?
I see where they're going with that comment. What I do want to say is the 60s I lump into two different eras. Okay. You had the pre-Beatles and the post-Beatles in the 60s, right?
Yes.
Before the Beatles, music was still kind of safe. You had Frankie Avalon, Annette Funicello, Bobby V, artists that were considered safe by the parents. I still love the music. Bobby Rydell is one of my favorites.
Mm-hmm.
They were all talented. Bobby Rydell could play drums. He was a great vocalist, but pretty safe. The parents would like that music too. Okay. And then you got the Beatles, right? The Mop Tops. Even though their music was pretty tame when they first came over, and then they got a little crazier, they stretched the envelope, going to India and seeing the Maharishi and all of that. Their mind expanded along with the drugs they took, and the time started changing. I would say that you mentioned before for the 60s was basically right after the Beatles got to America, it started to expand. Now in the 90s, to be honest, I did my music trivia game 2 editions. The first edition was the 50s, basically 1955, 54 on, all of the 60s and the 70s. So I had to do another edition while I was moving those games. People said, what about the 80s and the 90s? Well, Bryan, I'll be honest. Half of the 80s I kind of liked, but after 86 on into the 90s, I really didn't pay attention. And you're probably going to go, that's blasphemy. I just didn't relate to it. But I do know in the 90s that country kind of changed. It became more commercial. You had the grunge. You had other types of music, the thrash metal. The hair bands were kind of going away by then, I think. So the 90s became kind of a new template of a variety of music that was all vying for popularity. And I suppose a lot of people your age and younger clung on to that as their era, right? And so that just naturally pushed everything back, right? So the 60s is now the 50s because we're doing new stuff, or we did new stuff in the 90s. So that's just natural to push all the order back. Just like in the 50s, it was pushing all the big band music back. And before that, it was the 30s music. Music is cyclical. And to me, that comment is a fair comment because it's all relative. You think about the parents who saw the Beatles and just freaked out, or they saw Elvis before that and freaked out. And they saw probably Frank Sinatra before that. And, you know, it's not my music, it's not what I grew up with. That's just natural to me. What's your
Yeah.
take on it?
I think you hit the nail on the head, like 100%. It's to fast forward about halfway through where you came back there is that 80s and early 90s. I think it went from what rock music kind of was in that 60s to 70s. And then it turned into kind of hyper consumerism. Like I was born midway through the 80s, so this is my perspective, right?
Sure.
But the 80s is a very like hyper consumerism. It's synth bands and hair metal and all the kind of like poppy computerized digitization starts kicking in, and you get that, and that's what it was. And there's definitely the lane of heavy metal, like the Metallica's coming in and taking over the world. But then everyone kind of gets sick of that kind of they say that grunge killed the hair bands, and I think there's a lot of validity to that. Not a whole lot of them survived after that grunge scene came in, and I think what grunge represented was what like the Beatles and rock and roll represented versus what the old guard was at the time. Is they came in and said, "Hey, we're the pendulum swinging the other direction to knock you guys back because this is not what we're all about." And it came with a very, I mean, just think of the name grunge. I think it describes the music really well. It's just kind of like a very washed out, dirty kind of a let's figure this out kind of vibe. And then all the different offshoots that came from that of the Smashing Pumpkins and Nine Inch Nails, and a really cool band that I like called Rage Against the Machine, which is like a hip hop version of a harder music. And I think that was just them kind of coming in to say like, hey, Frankie Valli, Duran Duran, get out of town. It's our turn now.
That's fair. And I know that producing a second for the record edition, the 80s and 90s, was hard for me because I had to do so much research where I lived the first edition, 50s, 60s, 70s. Yeah. And you lived the 90s where I basically kind of, not mine, not my cup of tea. For example, Eddie Vedder, couldn't stand him. I didn't like the way he sang. And it seemed like there's a lot of people that were singing in that same style back then. The grunge style or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, there are some songs I love the song No Rain.
Oh, great song. Super great.
I love that song. It was catchy, melodic, and just loved it. And then I remember You and I, a poppy little song by Ace of Base. The Sign, right?
Great song.
I felt guilty liking that song, but you were a little kid and you loved it.
It was just like sunshine set to music is what that song felt like. And I think they were like a Swedish band or something like that coming out, and they brought the heat. Speaking of that kind of like just poppy sound, that was fun. That was a guilty pleasure. But I got to give you credit. I mean, to say that era was a blind spot, you bought me an album that I listened to front to back still to this day, and that's Weezer's Blue Album. For any of you boomers out there that are looking for something that's from after your high school days, that is a zero skip album. That is so good. And you bought that for me, and I still have it to this day, and I've purchased several copies, one on vinyl and several digital, I'm sure. It's that's a good one.
Brian, by blind spot, I mean that I didn't engulf myself in it. Like, what was I doing when I heard that song? That's how it was for me with all the oldies music. With 80s and 90s, it's like, oh, yeah, I like, look at this video. They're doing a Buddy Holly thing on the Happy Days set. I'll give that to Brian. Weezer, I kind of like this one. Yeah, music is amazing. It's generational. You can plug into the old stuff. You can plug into the new if you want. I know that I am starting to really enjoy 40s music, checking into that. I know Quincy mentioned his dad loved jazz from back then, the Artie Shaw, the Glenn Miller.
I go down a Dave Brubeck hole all the time because I like to go back to a comment you made earlier. Something that sticks out, it's quirky. If a song has a different time signature, and he's got a lot of stuff like that where he takes a weird signature and gives it okay, this has a groove to it. I like this. He's very good at that. Very good.
Take at that. 5. Plus,
yep.
He was cooler than hell. He's got the thick glasses on, and he'll just kind of give a glance over to the drummer, and then the drummer will, throw a nice little fill. They just played off each other so well. Good call on that, Dave Brubeck.
Yep.
You're watching My Boomer Buddies podcast. This is a special read between the lines, and that's REED, right, Brian? Between the lines with my nephew, Bryan Reed, and we're having a wonderful conversation like we usually do. And the only difference here is we're sharing it with all of you in the audience. And make sure that you like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Brian, the numbers are going up. It's pretty exciting. And also listen to us on Spotify and Buzzsprout. Bryan Reed, my nephew, knowledgeable, cool. And I got to point out, I have another nephew that's pretty cool too, Cole Ehlers. And I'm very blessed to have a couple of great, wonderful nephews. And I'll have to get Cole on as well. Wouldn't it be dangerous if you two were on together?
Ooh, watch out now. Watch out now. Hide the kids, hide the wives.
Yeah. So we're going to close this out now. Brian, I want to get some closing thought or two, or maybe you have a question for me before we wrap up. Talk about anything, music, TV, movies from back in the day. Any thoughts?
No, that's a great question. I call it that Weezer Blue album for boomers who maybe are looking for something out of their generation. Could you think of a good album for someone who's maybe my age that they wouldn't be aware of from that 60s and 70s? That's not a Rolling Stones. It's not a Beatles. I'm looking for like a Paul Revere and the Raiders. Give me someone who you're like, hey, if you haven't thought of these guys, you haven't heard them on the radio.
I got several, but there's one that comes to mind. I absolutely love Buffalo Springfield. They had some mega people in that band. Stephen Stills, Neil Young, and Richie Furay were the main, contributor singers. They went on obviously to form other groups, but listen to Buffalo Springfield, and Richie Furay went on to form Poco. You know what the other two did, but Poco was a pioneering country rock act that doesn't get the credit it's due. And Richie Furay, I think, is 80 years old now. He looks great and he still sings great. So I would say check out Poco, Picking Up the Pieces, and just get the Buffalo Springfield retrospective album. Those are 2 for 1. I gave you a 2 for 1 on there. And I think generations now will appreciate what they brought to music now. Because a lot of what you hear, if you like country, guess what? They were the Eagles before the Eagles, technically. A couple of their bass players ended up joining the Eagles from Poco, but I'd say check them out.
Excellent choices. Excellent choices. And very good answer. I should ask you that more often.
I got plenty. For My Boomer Buddies podcast, I'm Rick Reed, and for Flying Bryan Reed, my nephew, thanks for watching, and we hope you'll tune in next time. If you're new here, glad you're here. Please subscribe, and if you've been here before, keep coming back. We love it. We absolutely love it. Until next time, we'll see you around the block.
If you enjoy this podcast and are viewing on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button on your screen, and share it with your friends, and feel free to comment below. You can also hear us on Spotify and Buzzsprout. Feel free to email comments to myboomerbuddies4@gmail.com.